Okay, thank you very much. Thanks so much to Fudan University, to the China Institute, to Chris and the other organizers of today's event. It's a great honor to be invited here. So thanks on behalf of myself, but also Friends of Socialist China. And thanks in particular to Professor Zhang Weiwei for inviting us. I think, Zhang Weiwei, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most important voices inside China, attempting to explain the reality of China and tell the truth of China, particularly to a Western and to an English-speaking audience. And his books that are published in English, The China Wave, The China Horizon, are categorized as must-read books. I would strongly encourage people to read them if they haven't done so already. And in terms of my own intellectual journey, understanding China's history, its politics, its culture, its traditions, its mindset were quite formative, quite foundational to me. So thank you very much again for inviting us. It's a great honor. I wanted to say a few words about my book, which is called The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century, a book which was written between 2021 and 2023 and then published in 2023. And I wanted to provide some sort of justification for having written it, because there's lots of books that are written about China that can be purchased in the West. And if you look at the Amazon bestsellers list for books about China, you'll find titles such as China's New Tyranny, or How China Took Over the World While America's Elite Slept, or Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. So there's a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of presenting negative portrayals of China. And I wanted to enter into a slightly less crowded marketplace and firstly present China's successes, because, as I said, there's lots of negative stories that are told about China, but there's nothing said about some very important successes of Chinese socialism, most obviously in terms of poverty alleviation and what the United Nations describes as the most successful and the most wide-ranging poverty alleviation program in history. According to World Bank figures, that famous Marxist organization, the World Bank, China has lifted 800 million people from poverty in the last 40 years. 100 million of those in the last 10 or 12 years alone, with the launch of the targeted poverty alleviation campaign, when literally millions of cadres were sent into the countryside to identify those individuals, those families, those communities living in poverty, and to work with them to find a route out of poverty, a sustainable route out of poverty. So they moved out of poverty and they stayed out of poverty. And the result of that is that as of 2021, and the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, out of China's population of 1.4 billion people, there are 0 people living in extreme poverty. And that doesn't just mean that they're above the internationally defined threshold of $2.10 per day of cash income. It also means a guarantee of dignified housing, a guarantee of nutritious food, a guarantee of decent clothing, a guarantee of clean water piped into your home, a guarantee of electricity piped into your home, a guarantee that your children go to school for at least 10 years, and a guarantee that if you get sick, you see a doctor. So according to this definition of being out of poverty, then to be just above that threshold in China, anywhere else in most of the global south, most of the third world, most of the developing world, is to be essentially middle class. Certainly to be where my father comes from in India, if you've got food on the table and a roof over your head and you're not in debt bondage and your children go to school, then you're effectively middle income, middle class. The other very important thing that doesn't get talked about in the West in relation to China's successes is the fact that China is the only renewable energy superpower in the world. China is responsible for 60% of all wind power production and all solar power production in the world. And that's coming from almost nothing 15 or 20 years ago. 98% of the world's electric buses are manufactured in China. 70% of the world's high-speed rail is found here in China. 2/3 of the world's electric vehicles are here in China. China's the world leader in biodiversity protection, in forestation, and in pollution reduction. So these are extraordinary successes, world-shaking, unprecedented successes that I think people in the West should know about if they're going to have a realistic and a balanced understanding of contemporary China. And it's also very important to mention that this has been in the context of China's peaceful rise, a consistently peaceful foreign policy. China hasn't been at war in over 4 decades, at a time when the United States has been constantly at war, be it in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and now, of course, waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. The United States has 800 overseas military bases. China has 1 in Djibouti to protect shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean. The United States has around 5,500 nuclear warheads. China has around 500. And furthermore, China is the only nuclear power to have a consistent policy of no first use. It's literally written into China's constitution that China would never use nuclear weapons except in retaliation for a nuclear strike against it. And that policy has been in place since China's first successful nuclear test in 1964. One can compare China's response to the crisis, to the genocide in Gaza, with that of the United States. China, from the very beginning, from October 2023, has called for a unilateral, immediate, and comprehensive ceasefire and withdrawal of Israeli troops. Meanwhile, the United States has been providing the weapons with which this genocide is being waged, it's been providing the money with which this genocide is being waged, and it's been providing the diplomatic cover for this genocide. Similarly, in Ukraine, the US and its allies in the West, in Western Europe in particular, have been pouring fuel onto the fire in the hope of fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, whereas China has been working with the African Union, China has been working with Brazil to try and bring about a negotiated, diplomatic, peaceful solution that meets the legitimate security interests of all parties concerned. So, essentially this means presenting China as a partner on humanity's overall journey towards a more prosperous, a more peaceful, and a more sustainable future. Connected to that, with the book, I wanted to clear up some misconceptions and misunderstandings of China, debunk some myths, and counter the propaganda war. So many people in the West are led to believe through the media, through the education system, that China is engaged in a genocide or a cultural genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, or that China is a climate criminal, or that China's trapping the countries of Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific in debt traps, or that China's spying on the West, that it's trying to undermine our democracy and all the rest of it. And this creates a sort of anti-China sentiment which serves to justify and build public support for Western governments' anti-China positioning and aggression, be that in the form of Cold War measures such as tariffs or a chip war or a crackdown on Huawei or TikTok or attacks on Chinese scientists and researchers and students in the West and particularly the US, or in the form of hot war measures and an escalating campaign of containment and encirclement of China, including 300 US military bases in the Pacific region, including the deployment of literally hundreds of thousands of US troops in South Korea, in Japan, in Okinawa, in Guam, in Australia, in the Philippines, the creation of the AUKUS trilateral nuclear pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, the revival of the quadrilateral security dialogue, and so on. So what I tried to put forward in the book is that Cold War on China and potential hot war on China are disastrous for humanity at a point in our journey as human beings where we desperately need peace, we desperately need peaceful, mutually beneficial cooperation on climate change, on pandemics, on global development and modernization. And the third and final real key tenet of this book is to deal with some misunderstandings of China's social system. There's almost a consensus in the West, and Professor Zhang alluded to this in his introduction, that China has become a capitalist country. The only division is to whether that's a good or a bad thing. You have right-wingers who think that, well, China was socialist for 30 years, from 1949 until 1978, and it was a disaster, and it was a basket case country, and then they adopted They adopted capitalism from the third plenum in 1978, and then things have been better since then. Of course, this is nothing like a credible or viable narrative, because it doesn't explain why, of all the capitalist countries in the global south, of all the capitalist developing countries, it's only China that has succeeded to the extent that it has done. It doesn't explain why India hasn't succeeded to that extent. India is a very similar country in terms of size, in terms of location, in terms of history. India won its independence in 1947. China won its liberation in 1949. And India's been a capitalist country from the start. India's had a 30-year head start on China. So if capitalism is the magic ingredient for success, then India should be far ahead of where China is. But the simple fact is that India's economy is about 4 or 5 times smaller than that of China, and there's hundreds of millions of people living in India that don't have access to a dignified housing or nutritious food or modern energy, and their children don't go to school. And the life expectancy in India is about 10 years lower than it is in China. So we can throw this right-wing narrative out without any problems. And then there are elements of the left, and you could say the ultra-left, that say, well, China was socialist, and then it went capitalist, and that's a bad thing because it used to be the most equal country in the world, and now it's highly unequal, and there's the penetration of global capitalist brands. I'm sure I wouldn't have to walk very far from the gates of Fudan University to find a branch of Starbucks or McDonald's. And this is really a kind of highly ideological and dogmatic narrative that ignores these successes, that thinks that lifting 800 million people out of poverty isn't particularly important, and preventing the world from climate catastrophe isn't terribly important. So I try to explain China's successes as a function of its socialism, as a function of the location of political power in the people, and particularly the working class and the peasantry. Hence the title, The East is Still Red. The East was red and it's still red. And what I contend is that if decisions were made on behalf of a capitalist class, if decisions were made on behalf of people who own and deploy capital, and if resources were allocated on that basis, there's no way that China would have prioritized poverty alleviation to the extent that it has done. There's no way that China would prioritize improving people's living standards, especially those at the very bottom of society, in the way that it has done. There's no way that it would have prioritized development of renewable energy to the degree that it has. There's no way that it would have dealt with COVID-19 pandemic so successfully and have massively prioritized the preservation and protection of human life. There's no way that it would have deployed infrastructure throughout the country. We've just been in Jiayuguan, formerly a very poor, very small city in Gansu, which is incredibly modern. It's at a level of modernity that surpasses most big cities in the West. It's a quite incredible thing, as well as being green and clean and obviously having a very good quality of life. So in capitalism, in Western societies, there's a direct correlation between wealth and power that doesn't exist in China. And my view is that if we're socialists, if we're Marxists, if we uphold socialism as a better path for humanity, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to ascribe China's successes to capitalism. So, in summary, with the book, I've tried to build some understanding of China, to build solidarity with China, to learn from China, and hopefully make some small contribution to people-to-people links. Thank you.